It can be really confusing when you're looking at military vehicles for sale, as there are millions of different types, and many of them look very similar. It's impossible for me to talk about every truck ever made, but it only makes sense to start with the M-Series cargo vehicles. I'm very familiar with these vehicles since I own two of them, and I've looked at several others for sale over the years. These vehicles were purchased by the United States Armed Forces starting in the late 1940s and continuing on even through today. I'll start by providing some background on how the M-Series came to be, and then we'll cover every M-Series medium-duty cargo vehicle. Before and during World War II, the U.S. Army mostly used civilian vehicles. And although there were some common vehicles like the CCKW and the Willys MB and the Dodge WC series, each of these vehicles had their own components, and there were many other vehicles that were used less prominently, especially as the war ramped up and production couldn't keep up with demand. The Army learned a lot during the war, and after the war, they really worked to streamline their logistics and make everything run more smoothly. One thing they wanted to do was standardize a lot of their supplies. If the same part fits multiple vehicles, you can keep more trucks on the road with fewer spare parts. That's the idea behind the M-Series trucks. Batteries, lights, distributors, spark plugs, gauges, steering wheels, door latches, oil, basically any part that can be used on multiple vehicles was used on all vehicles. Only things like engines, transmissions, axles, and body panels were specific to each vehicle. This significantly reduced the supplies needed to maintain a fleet of vehicles. Additionally, every M-Series vehicle was designed with off-road performance in mind. They could ford up to 3 feet of water with no preparation, and deep water fording kits allowed the trucks to drive in over 6 feet of water. Typically, the M-Series vehicle was given a model number during development or on adoption, and the model number was kept through multiple iterations unless a significant change was enacted, but we'll get into that later. Let's start with the M34. After World War II, the Army started taking proposals and held a trial for a new 2.5-ton truck to replace the GMC CCKW. One entrant was the Rio Motor Company. It was founded by Ransom E. Olds, the guy who also founded Oldsmobile. They built large trucks through the 1920s and 30s, including the famous Rio Speedwagon, which was the fastest commercial truck of its day. The Rio Company submitted their design for the M34. It was powered by their 331 cubic inch inline 6-cylinder gasoline engine, the largest of their Gold Comet series of engines. The M34 trucks were a big hit, and some of them went into service, but overall the M35 was a much bigger hit. The M35 was the exact same truck, but with 2 changes. The M34 had 11 by 20 single rear tires, and the bed had large wheel wells. And I think the bed might have been lower to the ground as well. The M35 had 9 by 20 tires with duals in the rear and had a flat cargo bed. Both of these trucks were meant to go into service, with the M34 having better performance off-road, but the M35 being more efficient on pavement, and the absence of the wheel wells also made cargo loading easier. However, they pretty quickly realized that the M35 was good enough, and the M34s were retired early or retrofitted into the M35 configuration. The early M35 vehicles were all gasoline powered. The Army started experimenting with multi-fuel engines to further streamline their supplies and ensure the trucks could be powered in extreme shortages. These early experiments resulted in the M35A1 rebuild, which was very short-lived. Early gasoline trucks proved to be very reliable and they often stuck around, seeing service all the way into the late 70s. These engines even saw modifications of their own. Some of them were even bored out 40 thousandths over, upping the displacement to 337 cubic inches. They also upgraded the main bearings and rod bearings. I don't know too much about these upgrades. I can't find much information on them online. If you know something, please let me know. I know my truck was overhauled at a place called TEAD, T-E-A-D. I don't know if it's an acronym. At first I thought it was an Air Force base, but I couldn't find any information on it. If someone can confirm what this place is, I'd appreciate it. Anyway, my truck was rebuilt in 1972 and received the larger main bearings and rod bearings, but the cylinder was not bored out. I am glad that the cylinder wasn't changed for a couple reasons. First, it would make parts like cylinder rings harder to find, and it also reduces the size of the cylinder sleeves, which basically act as removable cylinder walls. And these cylinder sleeves are one of the reasons that the Gold Comet engine is so reliable. If a cylinder wall is damaged, it can be replaced and the block can be reused. The A1 series had the LDS 427-2 multi-fuel engines, with one of two models of Schweitzer turbo. The 427 engine was short-lived because it had weak head gaskets. The larger LD 465-1 engine was developed, which is actually 478 cubic inches to make things more complicated. This came naturally aspirated, or with one of two turbos, the early Whistler turbo, nicknamed for its distinct sound, or the later non-Whistler turbo. The turbo wasn't added to increase horsepower. It was more to clean up the thick black smoke emitted from the exhaust that could give away the position of a convoy of these trucks. The turbo only added like 5 horsepower, and honestly, there isn't that much difference in the power between all three of these engine options. The M35A3 retrofit started in the mid-90s, but was only performed up until 1999. The same truck got upgraded with a Cat 3116 diesel engine and an Allison 1545 4-speed automatic transmission. The A3 model also ditched the old NDCC non-directional cross-country tires in favor of new super single tires which performed better and also had modern conveniences like a central tire inflation system and beadlock wheels. In the early 90s, they were experimenting with engine and transmission options, and one of those options was the Cummins 6BT, also known as the 12-valve Cummins of Dodge Ram fame. This engine was paired with the same transmission as the A1 and A2 variant. Some trucks were made and several kits were produced with the correct engine mounts and transmission adapter plates. However, these kits are very rare now, but with some ingenuity, pun intended, this swap is still possible. Speaking of the transmission, I'll talk about the rest of the drivetrain of the standard M35 and, as far as I'm aware, all the other rebuilds. The M35 had a Spicer 3052 5-speed transmission. The fifth gear was a direct drive, meaning it had a 1-to-1 gear ratio. This meant that the speed that the engine was turning was the same speed that the drive shaft was turning. A major difference between a gasoline engine and a diesel or multi-fuel engine is that the diesel engine cannot achieve as high RPM. Because of that, a direct drive would be too slow. If you were to hook up a multi-fuel engine to a transmission from a gasoline engine, the truck would not go above 44 miles an hour. I know that because the transmission for a multi-fuel is the 3053A. The transmission has the same case, and fourth gear on the 3053A is the same gear set in the same position as fifth gear on the 3052. They took the same transmission, they replaced the gears in the fourth position with an overdrive gear so that the truck could reach 60 miles an hour in top gear. That's the reason for the weird shift pattern in the multi-fuel powered trucks. The other gear ratios are also slightly changed to accommodate the multi-fuel engine. The transfer case in the original M35 and the A1 and A2 variants was made by Rockwell, and it was a 2-speed transfer case. The original M35 had a Sprague mechanism to activate the front wheels automatically when the rear wheels break traction. This simplified operations for the driver, but sometimes it cuts on when it shouldn't, causing a rough ride, and sometimes it doesn't cut on when it should. Therefore, the A2 models had the transfer case upgraded with an air locking system. So the front wheels could be engaged at any time using air pressure from the brake system. I don't know what transfer case the A3 models had, nor what mechanism the A1 models used to engage the front wheels. All M35 models used Rockwell top-loader axles, but I'm not sure about any internal changes in the axles or if they used different sizes of the axles. The M34 and M35 trucks are the troop carrier cargo bed versions of the truck. The C variant had bedsides that fold down for easier loading, creating a flatbed. This would be the M35C or the M35A2C. The chassis cab version were given model numbers of their own, the M44 for the single-tire version and M45 for the dually version. The M36 has the same troop carrier cargo bed, except it has a longer wheelbase and a longer bed. But the longer bed does not mean the truck has a higher payload capacity. The 2.5-ton trucks had a lot of variations for specific jobs. The M47 is a dump truck version of the M35, same with the M59 and the M342, although these versions could also function as troop carriers. This is where the confusion lies, because there's so many different model numbers for essentially the same truck with small changes, and of course, in the civilian market, the dump truck bed may be removed and a regular cargo bed added, but the data plate will still say M47. The M48 and M275 are tractor truck versions. They had a shorter wheelbase and a tractor-trailer style fifth wheel hitch, and they had independent trailer brake systems. The M49 and M49C are fuel tankers, and the M50 is a water truck version. The M60 and M108 are wrecker versions with rotating booms. The M109 is a shop van version, and it would probably make a good camper. And the M292 is a van body with expanding sides, ideal for a mobile command post. Then there are some variations of these van bodies that have different modifications based on their specific uses, such as missile launching trucks, telephone line or pipeline construction, earth boring, etc. M756 and M764 are two more models I'm aware of, but I'm sure I'm missing more. Also, keep in mind that once these trucks hit the civilian market, any modification could have been made. Here is an M109 truck that should have a shop van body, but it has a cargo bed from an M35, but the data plate on the cab will still say M109. And that's not even scratching the surface of the options for truck beds on the civilian market. Even though the truck was designed by Rio, they couldn't produce the trucks fast enough for the Army's liking. So the Army took the blueprints for the engine and gave them to Continental. So Continental could produce engines for the trucks, and the truck as a whole was produced by a laundry list of manufacturers throughout its run, including Studebaker, Bombardier, AM General, Curtiss-Wright, and more. The idea of multiple companies producing the same vehicle for the Army is a trend that you will see in many M-Series vehicles. Rio won the contract to make the new Deuce and a half, and GMC didn't like that they weren't consulted. It makes sense since they supplied the CCKW truck used extensively during World War II, and a new contract had a huge potential for revenue. GMC volunteered their self-funded prototype, which would eventually be designated as the M135. The M135 is very similar to the M34 in that it has the 11x20 single tires and the wheel wells in the bed. However, the M135 looks nothing like the M34. The front end is more sloped, and it looks very much like an evolution of the CCKW. Even the gasoline engine design was very similar to the CCKW, just larger. The engine was a 302 cubic inch inline-six gasoline engine, and at that point, GMC engines were not related to Chevy engines, so it has some visual similarity to Chevy Stovebolt 6 engines, but there are some differences and parts may not be interchangeable. Interestingly, the M135 had an automatic transmission, something that was quite unheard of for a large truck in its day, although it's quite common now. Unfortunately, like many ideas that are ahead of their time, it had some problems early on. Most prominently, the transmission could catastrophically self-destruct if driven in reverse in the high range. The very early trucks had other transmission problems, but the defective transmissions were replaced, and troops were trained to only use reverse in the low range. This transmission had a high range and a low range on two different sides of the shift column, and each side had 2 forward positions and 1 reverse. F1 was for normal driving, and F2 was for off-roading or heavy loads. In the F2 position, shifts are delayed, occurring higher in the power band for max horsepower, and downshifting occurs early to induce engine braking to slow the vehicle down without relying on the brakes. Interestingly, because the transmission has the high or low range, the transfer case does not. It only has 2 positions, neutral or engaged. Another interesting difference, because the axles are not Rockwell top-loader axles, the transfer case has 2 rear outputs, and the rear drive shaft goes through a pillow block mounted on the intermediate axle. This means that there is an extra component that the gear oil needs to be changed and checked in regularly. Just like with the M35, a version was made with a flatbed and 9x20 duals. It was called the M211, and it was far more popular than the M135. However, the M211 didn't catch on with the US Army, so few were used and most were pawned off early at government surplus auctions or gifted to the US Forest Service, National Guard units, state and local governments. The Air Force had more M211s than the Army, and Canadian Armed Forces used the M211 quite extensively. My truck is a 1952 XM211. The X stands for experimental. I'm not sure what exactly makes it experimental, but the July 1951 version of the manual TM9-819A only lists the M135. It only shows the M135, and it only lists the tire size as 11x20. The earliest manual I've been able to find referencing the M211 is TM9-8024, which I've only seen published in or after 1955, and the manual referenced on the data plates on my truck is TM9-819A. This evidence tells me that my truck may have been one of the first M211s. Along with the M211 came the other versions like the tanker truck, dump truck, etc. These were the M215, M217, M220, M221, and M222. Because the M211 had a relatively shorter service life, there weren't as many different versions or designated rebuilds. Despite that, M211 and M135 trucks were even used in Vietnam. Because the truck is a GMC, the engine is compatible with many old GMC truck transmissions. So if you find an M135 or M211 with a bad transmission, you can do what the previous owners of my truck did and swap in a manual transmission from an old GMC dump truck. I learned something surprising while researching for this video. I always assumed that the 5-ton trucks were just beefed up versions of the 2.5-ton trucks, sort of like how the F250 and F350 trucks share the same platform. There's only slight differences to increase the towing and payload. That's not an unreasonable assumption considering the two trucks have always looked very similar. If you compare an early 5-ton with an early 2.5-ton truck, especially from the front, they look pretty much identical. Maybe you pick up on some slight different proportions. That's extremely evident from the side view or a front 3/4 view. But it almost looks like everything was just scaled up. That's true for every iteration of these trucks, even the M923 and the M35A3. However, the first 5-ton trucks were designed by International Harvester. It does make sense that the development would be different because, while the M35 is a direct replacement for the CCKW, the 5-ton truck was designed to replace a wide variety of 4 or 6-ton trucks that the US used previously. But similar to the Rio M35, the 5-ton was adopted as the M39 platform, or chassis cab, and different configurations were given different model designations, most notably the M54 cargo truck, M51 dump truck, M52 tractor truck, and the M62 and M546 wrecker. Another interesting variant is the M246 wrecker tractor truck. As the name suggests, it is a 5-ton with a rotating boom wrecker that also has a 5th wheel hitch. It was designed to be an aircraft recovery vehicle that could pull its own trailer and load it. These trucks were originally powered by a 602 cubic inch Continental inline-6 gasoline engine. Some of the M54 and M52 trucks were retrofitted with Mack diesel engines, creating the A1 variant. Eventually, these trucks and the other ones were fitted with the LDS 465-1 multi-fuel engine, creating the A2 variant. This brought the 2.5-ton and 5-ton trucks even closer together, because now they had the same engine. This generation of 5-ton also had the same Spicer 5-speed transmission with or without the overdrive gear. Although I am slightly confused whether the multi-fuel version had the overdrive transmission or not. This table from TM9-2320-211-10 shows the shift speeds being the same for the gas and multi-fuel engines. Later in the manual, the shift patterns for the Mack diesel engine shows it to be the overdrive transmission. And it talks about how the diesel engine had a different shift pattern, but I found nothing about the multi-fuel engines. Either way, they sat on Rockwell top-loader axles, although I'm not sure if the axles were exactly the same or if they just had the same design. These trucks ran the larger 11x20 tires and ran them with dual rear wheels. They updated the design of the 5-ton trucks as the M809 series, dropping the multi-fuel engines because they weren't powerful enough. The M809 was driven by a Cummins NHC 250 engine. Interestingly, this was a naturally aspirated diesel engine. It had no turbo. The engine was 855 cubic inches and made 240 horsepower and 685 pound-feet of torque. For reference, the gas engine of the M39 series made 224 horsepower. The multi-fuel engine, I'm seeing different numbers, but I'm seeing anywhere from 130 to maybe 175. I suspect that those numbers are gross horsepower versus service ready. My Rio engine makes 146 horsepower gross. That's with no accessories and open exhaust ports. However, after adding accessories such as a water pump, air compressor, and generator, and adding the very restrictive exhaust manifold and air filter, which is probably more restrictive because it has to stand up to dusty environments, the horsepower in this service-ready configuration drops way down to 127. The Cummins engine was the only major change to the driveline, and everything else is the same except the transfer case had an air engagement like the M35A2. The cargo bed version was the M813, M817 for the dump truck, M818 for the tractor truck, and M819 for the wrecker. The M939 series was a facelift similar to the M35A3 to extend the service life of these trucks, although some brand new M939 series trucks were built. They either used the same old engine or the newer Cummins 6CTA 8.3 turbocharged diesel. The hood was changed to a more modern design. The stupid-looking oversized air filter was removed from the fender so that you can actually use the flat fenders for what they were designed for, sitting on while you're working on the truck. And the air cleaner was hidden below the cab with a snorkel coming up behind the cab. Also, the tires were 14x20 beadlock super singles with a much better tread pattern for off-road driving. And these trucks had central tire inflation, so these perform very well off-road. The transmission was upgraded to an Allison automatic. I don't know about the transfer case, but apparently in low range it has locking 6-wheel drive, but in high range it is air controlled. The axles appear to be the same as far as I can tell. Also, because of the bigger tires, the spare tire is relocated behind the cab, and it requires a built-in crane to handle it. The cargo trucks were designated M923 through M926. I don't know what the differences are between all of these models. The dump truck is the M929 or M930. The tractor truck is the M931 or M932, and the wrecker is the M936. Eventually, the 2.5-ton and 5-ton trucks were replaced by the Stuart Stevenson LMTV and MTV. And even though these technically have M-Series model designations, they are known more by their acronym, which is increasingly common for military vehicles since the 1990s. These trucks are easily distinguished from the previous trucks as they have a cab-over design. While many cab-over trucks have been made in the US, the concept hasn't taken off here as much as it has in other countries, so it's not surprising that this design originates from Austria. However, for US Army adoption, at least half of the vehicle must be of US origin. So the US Army version is powered by a Cat diesel engine and Allison automatic transmission. The first units were sent to the US Army for testing in 1989, but the truck didn't go into full-scale use until the early 2000s. These trucks are made both by Stewart and Stevenson, who have been bought out a few times now, and they've also been produced by Oshkosh. There's a million variations as they've been continually updated, and there's actually 4 main versions: a 4x4 2.5 ton light medium tactical vehicle, or LMTV, and a 6x6 medium tactical vehicle, or MTV, that comes in 5 ton, 9 ton, and 10 ton versions. I didn't talk about the other 10-ton trucks in this video because I would consider them along the lines of more of the heavy trucks, and these are the medium duty. I'm planning a separate video on those 10-ton and 20-ton and the larger trucks. As with the previous trucks, there's cargo versions, dump truck versions, wrecker versions, and enclosed van versions. However, a change in warfare tactics ushered in a change in the configuration of these vehicles. The LMTV and MTV have armored variations. Previous cargo vehicles never had armor, but with IEDs and convoy ambushes, the Army recognized the need to increase armor for their cargo vehicles. As far as I'm aware, there's no plans to move from the LMTV or MTV anytime soon. If you've watched the video all the way through, you probably like military vehicles as much as I do. If that's true, you'll probably like many of my videos. Here's 2 videos you can choose to watch right now. The one on the right is my guide to buying an old Army truck, and the one on the left is an adventure I had with my own Army truck, my 1952 Rio M35. Stay tuned for more of these deep dives into different types of military vehicles.